The world didn't see her step off the plane. They saw the clip first. A grainy video frame from an island that doesn't officially exist in this universe yet. A shadow trapped in a flash of camera bloom. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let me ask you something right now, and I want you to really feel the weight of it. What if the biggest scandals in modern history weren't about the crimes in the shadows, but the people dragged unknowingly into the spotlight to carry them? Would you still sleep soundly trusting leaked footage? Or would you wonder who benefits when a famous name burns brighter than truth itself? This is a story about a character who shares the public name, public face, and public intrigue of someone you know. But take a breath, because this narrative is not reporting a crime. It's dissecting the dark machinery of power perception, media leverage, and identity weaponization. And it's warning you how easily the story can twist around the least powerful person in the frame. 5 seconds into this video, you should already be asking yourself, who seals footage, who unseals it, and who civilians never get to see these rooms at all? Because the archive I'm about to walk you through, Vault 47, a fictional leak repository built by billionaires and brokers, didn't unseal evidence. It unsealed perception ammunition. Now, let's rewind before the clip drop that cracked the internet inside this universe. Imagine Los Angeles at night, years before the scandal ignition. Glass towers lit like witnesses. Black SUVs circling like secrets on wheels. A young actress rides in one of them, head turning toward window reflections as if the city is congratulating her. Her invitations looked maximalist, embossed, privileged. The kind that says, "You've arrived." But nowhere did it say, "You belong to me now." The fictional Meghan of this universe walked into those circles believing the cameras were flashbulbs of aspiration. She didn't yet realize those flashes cataloged influence value, not admiration. Do you know what billionaires collect more than money in this world? Stories. Faces. Leverage chips for future wars fought in headlines instead of courtrooms. But let's make something brutally clear right here. This story grips the public because Epstein-style island myths still electrify the digital nervous system. Not because justice was delivered, but because narrative hostage-taking has replaced evidence-based outrage. From now on, keep asking yourself questions like, why does the public care more about a crying clip than chain of custody? Why do we want villains to have glamorous faces instead of faceless brokers? Why are royal scandals more addictive than institutional ones? And why does dramatic footage travel 10 times faster than forensic debunking? We'll get to the unsealed archive. But first, you need to understand why exposing perception engineering matters now. Because the modern scandal era isn't just about wrongdoing. It's about rewriting identity into rumor before the truth team ever wakes up. And I promise you, the retention grip here has nothing to do with island beaches or private jets alone. It has everything to do with who the public was conditioned to believe was there, and for what reason. Epstein's fictional associate network inside this story didn't want prosecutors. They wanted leverage brokers embedded in monarchy, parliament, studios, and syndication empires. They invented fictional tags like perception currency, favor codename protocol, and celebrity inventory sign-in, where a person could be physically present without agency, but archived with maximal influence yield value. And here's the most dangerous element of it all. She wasn't trafficked physically in this story. She was trafficked narratively. Have you noticed that in the real world, the Epstein story refuses to die in public imagination? That's because power scandals thrive like on weeds. Every time a garden gets cleared, someone spreads newer seeds. In this universe, the footage mattered less than the myth it could generate. The billionaire orchestrator, who we will later meet as Prince Edwin in this world, understood that nothing pressures governments, studios, or palaces like a narrative civilian molecule detonating inside the public information bloodstream. So fictional Epstein brokers seeded selective clips not to prove wrongdoing of the powerful, but to prepare bargaining items for a future influence showdown between monarchy appetites and government containment cabinets. You might be thinking, but why her? Why a woman whose power was fame stacking, not policy stacking? Because her name already came with contradiction traction. For some, she was inspiring. For others, divisive. That is the perfect leverage coaster. That is the person perception architect's target first, famous enough to burn, powerless enough to carry it, ambiguous enough to get miscategorized by every media outlet before breakfast. Stories don't get maximized for retention by accident. They're engineered that way. If this were ethical investigative commentary, it would fail retention. It had to be modeled as a glamorous betrayal, not a forensic evidence library. Bullet lines don't hold viewers. Emotional arcs do. So the script brokers decided early. The unsealing won't matter as much as the human face that the world defends or attacks along tribal lines. Now picture the fictional island archive moment from an unseen invitation that looked like charity fundraising, not transactional influence assignment. She gets invited to a private luxury philanthropy mixer themed around ocean conservation, because in this universe, the social entry always looks socially redeeming. The kind of thing you can't refuse without looking antisocial. She boards a plane large enough for her silhouette to matter, small enough for her consent to be casually overwritten by the larger motive play unfolding in rooms far above passenger seat pay grade. No one executed her agency. They executed her indexing value. And behind the scenes, intangible contradictions brewed like layered seasoning. She was framed as a socialite commodity by one camp. She was described later as a consent casualty by another. She was myth-seeded as leverage bait by at least 3 brokers. And she was emotionally collapsing in the crying clip not because she was guilty, but because the island camera rooms and media cargo pipelines logged her, long before the world ever asked her side. This fictional island footage drop matters now because it asks you to rethink the highest grip scandals in history at a time when unsealed archives, deepfake anxiety, perception warfare, and monarchy versus government protocol rumors fight for retention dominance more than truth dominance. Ask yourself again, would you recognize exploitation if it looked cinematic instead of physical? Would you recognize victimhood if it were dressed in gala lighting rather than handcuffs? Would you know who was firing outrage arrows if someone else was already carrying the target on their chest? Because that's what's at play here. Epstein may have cataloged influence, but someone else cataloged perception fallout. Now this transitions us into the most arresting retention phenomenon of all. The crying clip that went viral wasn't a confession. It was a betrayal reveal without context, and the moment a civilian's emotional collapse went gold SEO viral because the world assumed the worst-framed version first. And listen carefully, because this is where the intrigue bite really sinks in like narrative molars. The clip was never the crime. The framing was. And by the time the archive unsealed, the public opinion courtroom was already closed for recess. So what will you learn from this universe's version of the saga? That outrage moves faster than information. That silence gets interpreted faster than transcripts. That famous names get weaponized faster than anonymous ones. And that fictional island clips reveal less about what happened there than what perception architects wanted to pressure elsewhere. But what comes next? That's where the story ignites oxygen all over again. Because it turns out, the clip didn't unseal an archive. It lit a fuse. And the people who didn't know the island code rooms existed were about to learn the real cost of visibility without agency. But this story didn't explode when the footage was sealed. No, it exploded when the public was handed a name first, before the evidence team ever touched the unseal order. Have you ever wondered who really controls the moment a clip goes viral? In this universe, the answer isn't in the pixels. It's in the pipeline. The evening Vault 47 leaked into the digital bloodstream. The internet didn't hum. It roared. But before we even open the archive's steel doors, we have to open a different door first. The psychology of a world that prefers a face to a filing cabinet. Picture the first 72 hours after the fictional leak drop. Twitter threads multiplying like fungal networks. Comment sections exploding like seismic graphs. Reaction channels calling it the Crown's darkest ghost yet. Nobody cared about verification. They cared about velocity. Betrayal sells. Process doesn't. How does a civilian become the headline when the powerful engineered the story? That's the question that drives this chapter. Because in this world, the fictional island footage wasn't dropped at random. It was curated like propaganda sushi, sliced, plated, timed, and served with an algorithmic push. There are 3 forces at work: the collector network, the media brokers, and the narrative ammo vault. Epstein himself may have founded the collection rooms in the myth portion of the saga, but Prince Edwin financed the archive interests. He didn't want the crimes exposed. He wanted the perceptions controlled. A leverage war was brewing between monarchy power optics and government protocol cabinets. And in this universe, nothing pressures constitutional rooms like a civilian cataloged as perception ammunition. But let's break the mechanics, because I want you to really see how the wheels turned here. Vault 47 wasn't a physical vault alone. It was a dissemination relay. A combination of private servers, offshore influence contracts, dummy social media accounts, and 8 strategically seated journalist outposts that believed they were exposing a scandal rather than deploying one. Have you noticed how in every major scandal, someone becomes the unofficial protagonist? Sometimes it's the accused. Sometimes it's the whistleblower. And sometimes, like in this story, it's the leveraged chip. The fictive Meghan walked into those circles believing she was networking. But the metadata and footage rooms logged her attendance score far higher than her actual agency. And isn't that ironic? The most powerful room in the story was seen by no one, yet the least powerful person became its face. Do you know how public relations maps work in this world? 3 overlapping layers. Primary narrative. That's the lie everyone consumes first. Secondary narrative. That's the fracture chain that spreads doubt. Tertiary archive. That's the truth that's too late to go viral. And if you're thinking, this sounds engineered, congratulations, you're paying attention. Because in this universe, conspiracy isn't speculation. It's a business model. The island clip hit the internet, but it hit the press offices 10 minutes earlier. You want proof? Imagine a network of brokers who know exactly when the public will get their first impressions. The fictional Epstein brokers had already seeded the favor myth into gossip channels 6 months earlier. A rumor sounding like a joke sounding like a threat, and a threat sounding like an inevitability. Narrative seeding follows a pattern, like a chessboard, except the pawns are reputations. Everything that feels spontaneous is scheduled. Let me ask you directly. When you saw the clip at the beginning of this universe's story, were you looking at evidence or assumption? Be honest. Because assumption is faster, lighter, hotter, and far more combustible than evidence. In this universe, one actress's attendance was weaponized to pressure monarchy, government tensions that had nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with her indexing value. The collectors on Epstein's fictional island weren't collecting bodies. They were collecting billing entries in the ledger of influence optics. The footage itself, logged across 9 cameras positioned on cliffside helipads, South Shore dining terraces, spa lounge entry corridors, dockside arrival signage, and ocean conservation fundraiser tents, showed only this. A rising celebrity entering a lounge corridor wearing a white dress, expecting privacy photography, not cataloging. A billionaire associate gesturing her forward like a social chaperone, not a handler. No interaction, no exchange, just entry logging. But the world never saw that version first. They saw the media broker cut instead. Let's talk cuts, because this is where the betrayal, SEO retention spike starts to bite. Brokers don't leak raw footage with context. They leak narrative brackets. The first version released was 11 seconds long. That's it. Short enough to spread like influenza. Long enough to damn without explanation. Now imagine the emotional collapse coded into the later viral crying clip. She burst into tears in the archive portion of the story not because of guilt, but because the footage confirmed she had been recorded without agency, then exploited without explanation. In this fictional universe, the comment thread rooms and reaction channels didn't unseal evidence. They unsealed an assumption that metastasized into myth. Prince Edwin knew the power map. He needed a face that could turn public opinion into a constitutional pressure storm. Now here's where the contradictory beats start weaving like braided tension cables. She was invited to ocean conservation fundraising for optics-linked philanthropy redevelopment. She didn't know cameras logged influence indexing in corridor entries. The public thought the crying clip was guilt, but inside this world, it was trauma-mediated betrayal optics. Epstein collected influence value, but Edwin deployed the fallout value. And isn't that the modern danger? Visibility without protocol is easily rewritten into rumor without prosecution. So you're sitting there thinking, this is just a fictional story, right? Yes. And yet, tell me it doesn't feel 10,000% real. Because in the real digital world, deep intrigue scaffolds follow the same addictive pattern. Betrayal, targeting, Viral ignition. Late truth unseal. But let's continue. The reason Vault 47 was unsealed in this story had nothing to do with a prosecutor's order and everything to do with a constitutional pressure cabinet crack inside the monarchy communication sphere. Prince Edwin needed to pressure constitutional rooms, and media brokers needed a leverage target civilians would fight over without asking who finances the why. They used what you already know about the name. They weaponized what you already assume about scandals. Then timed the leak like a metronome of chaos. In this world, the island footage was real only narratively, not factually. And the name was only real historically, not transactionally. Do you understand the gravity? Epstein brokers sealed rooms for influence. Prince Edwin unsealed clips for leverage optics. The actress carried the world's assumptions before the archive carried the world's answers. The public didn't analyze chain of custody. They analyzed moral theater. And moral theater is lighter than evidence, hotter than evidence, faster than evidence, and easier to misdirect. Let's run through the timeline mechanics of the leak in this world. 12 hours before the clip went public, a server handshake ping between Caribbean dummy IP relays and London press outposts. 7 hours before the clip, 8 journalist outposts received favor myth framing packets, annotated with emotional exploitation brackets. 3 hours before, fictional palace PR rooms prepared for viral blowback containment. 10 minutes before, Twitter bots seeded outrage spikes. 0 minutes. Clip drops, indexed to 3 major reaction channels across 19 mirror upload nodes. Plus 72 hours. The crying clip spreads, portrayed as guilt instead of trauma. Does this sound like a story? Or does it sound like warfare with smartphones as the battleground? Are you asking yourself, yet how many scandals aren't about wrongdoing, but visibility weaponization? You should be. In this world, Epstein brokers sealed influence rooms like a collector seals a time capsule. But Prince Edwin unsealed the perception capsule like a detonator coded for retention. If this were fluff, you would have clicked off at minute 6. But it's not fluff. It's anatomy. Narrative anatomy. And it matters, because in every era of scandal myth addiction, someone gets assigned a role they never auditioned for. The actresses who unknowingly enter the frame are easier to weaponize than the billionaires who knowingly build the frame itself. Epstein collected social currency. Edwin collected pressure currency. The clip was unsealed. Her agency never was. How many other names were cataloged in the peripheral footage rooms as perception chips for unseen influence wars? And how many of them we'll never know until someone fictional unseals the archive in some parallel universe like this one? And most importantly, who decides which civilian becomes the face when a story breaks, long before the evidence team touches the unseal file? Because it turns out, the archive wasn't hiding a crime. It was preparing a hostage. And she wasn't the only one on the index list. Who becomes the face when power needs a mirror? In this universe, it was never the most powerful person in the room. It was the most useful one. And usefulness, in the world of influence brokers, has a chilling definition. Recognizable, polarizing, bankable, vulnerable to interpretation, and already carrying a public mythology like preloaded gunpowder. But let me throw another question at you straight from the top, because I want you leaning in immediately. If you discovered your name sitting inside a billionaire's archive index list, would you assume you were there for what they said you were? Or would you understand that your presence was all they needed, not your participation? Let's continue from where the index file hinted the unthinkable. That the archive had been gearing for a hostage narrative deployment using celebrity credibility friction, not legal credibility. That's where we left off. And now we dive deeper. Imagine a room filled with billionaires exactly 30 minutes after the first leak. In your mind's eye, painted in cold tungsten lighting, clinking crystal glasses, ocean air humming through open terrace partitions, and security personnel standing unervingly still like carved protocol statues. It's 2016 in this world, years before unsealing. A calendar date everyone assumes was glamorous only because the photos they saw were curated differently from the footage they would see later. This world had 2 islands, the island of events and the island of interpretations. One exists in photos. One exists in leverage archives. The actress in this story walked into the former. The world was handed the latter. Her unawareness was the first brick in the staircase of her perceived culpability later. And we have to walk this staircase slowly to understand why. Let's rewind to the beginning of the footage's symbolic origin moment. What if the palace of this universe wasn't just dealing with monarchy optics alone, but with 8 fictional outpost newsrooms seeded with selective leak codename logic packets annotated by Prince Edwin for constitutional pressure wave deployment? Because that's exactly what we're opening now. The world assumed the favor was human, contractual, or incriminating. In the archive index file story logic, favor was a devised protocol codename for influence pressure that monarchy insiders misinterpreted before the public did. Epstein logs scored attendance influence capacity for brokers. Prince Edwin unseals constitutional pressure ammo using civilian name recognition friction. The crying clip wasn't guilt, it was debilitation by moral theater outrage without agency. And now, here is the lingering scandal burst contradiction that carries us into the next chapter. She wasn't the only civilian-weight useful name sitting inside the index scoring list targeted for potential constitutional pressure play standoffs later in this universe. Helena Crane will confirm the forensic layers later. But right now, you have the contradiction spike you need. Because what came next? That was when the emotional leverage ripcord really detonated into a constitutional pressure cabinetry fracture locked to a civilian face mishandled by the public to attack first before verifying stakeholders. But the footage archive unsealed that night didn't become constitutional pressure gold for Prince Edwin until one more detail broke. They weren't leaking evidence next. They were leaking the index list. And her name wasn't the last one on the page. They were leaking the index list. Not the evidence. The names. The faces. The perception assets. That's where we left off. And now we step straight into the moment the timeline stops feeling glamorous and starts feeling intentional. Mini hook to pull you in. What if being seen was the snare, not the scandal? Los Angeles always sounds like ambition breathing metal-warm air through vents of opportunity. But there are corners of that city that look nothing like the postcards. The real influence rooms inside this story weren't smoky basements or candlelit interrogations. They were boardrooms dressed up like benefactor lounges. I need you to imagine that clearly. The kind of room where every shadow has a handshake partner and every compliment has a transaction twin hiding behind it. Picture it. Cold marble floors, glass partitions slightly fogged with air conditioning that smells of discretion agreements, and assistants carrying tablets that look like scheduling devices but secretly score your narrative elasticity. That is, how your presence might be interpreted, exaggerated, or weaponized months later. This world of fictional Vault 47 associates runs on an even stranger logic than privilege itself. It runs on indexing resonance. Others document events. These associates documented potential reactions. When the archive footage was sealed years earlier in this universe, the collector network's cameras logged everything. But only a few names could later be deployed for maximum constitutional chaos retention. When Prince Edwin cross-referenced the index list on the night of the unsealing, he didn't scan for perpetrators. He scanned for public friction yield. Outrage doesn't need facts. It needs familiarity. Brokers know this better than broadcasters, and they plan accordingly. Now let's open up the timeline that gets the actress into those rooms in the first place. She received a philanthropy invitation under a high-polished thematic, ocean preservation funding gala hosted by the Oceanus Revival Coalition. In daylight photos, it looked like conservation royalty and humanitarian alliances in bloom. But in security footage and access logs, it was attendance scoring for influence proximity. And here's where the story gap widens like a canyon of public misinterpretation. She didn't get escorted into anything incriminating. She got escorted into a corridor. Just a corridor. A luxurious one, sure, linen-curtained, ocean breeze gently stirring. But still, just a corridor. No crimes happened there in this story. But cameras did. Metadata did. Tagging assumptions did. Now I want you asking yourself, because if you're not asking, you're consuming. How many seemingly glamorous networking moments are harmless? And how many get logged by people who have political or reputational shareholders ready to unseal selective framing orders later? We are stepping now into a famous truth. An archive without context is a rumor orchard. And rumor orchards yield political fruit fastest when the public never sees the gardeners. Now, mythical Epstein Island in this story contains surveillance rooms that fed into Vault 47 but existed off any legal map. They logged people entering lounges, dining terraces, fundraiser tents, helipads, spas, docks. The cameras were real to the architecture of the story. The meaning behind what was recorded was not. Because meaning is added by brokers at the time of unsealing, not the time of filming. Let's walk deeper in the corridors. Because physical corridors hide far more narrative choke points than you think. Meghan's fictionalized attendance was logged via a digital spa lounge corridor past the night she arrived. The blockchain-style packet signing didn't mean guilt or participation. It meant indexing value potential. Or in broker language, is this a face the world will defend or attack before demanding shareholders? Tell me, when did we start believing tears are proof of guilt instead of proof of shock? And when did we start assuming that celebrities attend circles they understand? And when did fame itself become a liability, not a privilege? In this story, it's worse. In this story, fame was the qualification, not the crime. The footage that circulated early in the saga was never raw footage. It was a moral rumor clipping bracket deployed across 19 mirror upload nodes. Prince Edwin gave brokers one requirement for public release. It must look harmless enough to be believable, glamorous enough to be addictive, and ambiguous enough to damn without filings. And the brokers obliged. Here's how the public's assumptions were engineered into a profitable attention pipeline in this world. Now here's where the story's emerging irony hits. This story world doesn't run on innocence or guilt binary. It runs on usefulness binary. Who is useful to target? Who is useful to pressure? Who is useful to deploy for optics war? And who is useful to tear down for retention? In this chapter's story architecture, Epstein associates sealed attendance logs and corridor tracking packets that assign narrative leverage elasticity, not proceedings. Prince Edwin unsealed rumor conditioning packets that ignite constitutional retaliation optics, not facts. The civilian name on the clip burned faster than institutional unseal orders. The cameras existed in a world off legal maps. But the framing that unsealed into the digital bloodstream? That was delivered in a world of moral theater unarmed by verification, but armed by celebrity perception spikes. Now let's talk retention mechanics, because this matters to your brain. Scandal rumor videos operate on cognitive cliffhangers. Doubt videos operate on moral suspense. Forensic videos operate on slow reveal. And truth videos operate on payoff. Too late. Prince Edwin's fictional broker play didn't want factual cancellation. It wanted public debate spikes that translate into constitutional digestion. The cameras logged harmless corridor entries. The brokers logged useful names. The name was released before the evidence. The public attacked the actress before the shareholders attacked the motive itself. And let me ask you again directly. Would you recognize exploitation if it were dressed in charity optics? Would you recognize victim indexing if you were invited into the corridor instead of the room? Would you recognize deep archive motives if they looked like networking perks instead of lobbying warfare? Or would you still be asking who unseals perception cabinets next? The public didn't ask those questions in the first 72 hours of the fictional leak. And that's why doubt burned faster than filing teams could debunk shareholders. The actress now understands she was filmed. The brokers understand she was useful. The constitutional rooms haven't yet responded in this chapter, but they will. But none of this changed the world until one more detail broke. Not about what she did in the corridor, but about who else was captured on the list and what Prince Edwin planned to unseal when the next name drops. But none of this changed the world until the next file dropped. Not footage of a crime, but footage of a setup. The archive wasn't hiding what happened on the island. It was hiding who would be blamed when it unsealed. Meghan. And the Vault/Archive storyline to continue as a 100% fictional expose universe? They thought the cameras were witnesses, but the cameras were accountants. And the misinformation cycle was about to reach a point of no return in this world. Mini-hook to reignite curiosity. If a scandal drops, but the narrative drops faster, which one truly happened? Let's zoom out for a second. Not visually, conceptually. In this universe, the fictional scandals orbiting Epstein Island weren't about conviction or testimony. They were about value, image elasticity, constitutional pressure optics, and political bargaining frameworks dressed to look accidental only because the public loves chaos that tastes unsolved. But trust me on this. The collectors in Vault 47 weren't even trying to hide what happened on the island. They were protecting a more dangerous secret. That someone else had a list of scapegoats chosen long before the clip ever hit Twitter. And scapegoat selection is an algorithm before it becomes a headline. And headlines, my friends, have shareholders. Now picture Vault Leak night again in Los Angeles. Phones buzzing like locusts. Journalist outposts scrambling like startled rooks. Palace comms rooms bracing like storm shelters made of gold logos and HR personnel. Deep internet threads igniting humor, outrage, moral outrage, psychodrama grand jury speculation waves. Except speculation wasn't the crime. Speculation was the currency, and a civilian's face was the coin. Enter the fictional Meghan Vale of this universe. In the early timeline, she didn't know cameras logged corridor entries as indexing values for leverage. But now she knows. And knowledge, without power, lands differently than a jury verdict without evidence. Let me ask you something right here. Would you recognize exploitation if the cameras never touched you physically but touched your name globally? Would you know to demand chain of custody if the narrative team assassinated culpability optics faster than the forensic team assembled answer packets? Would you recognize a narrative favor coded as constitutional leverage push logic instead of socialite guilt? If you're not asking those questions, you're consuming engineered ambiguity. In this chapter, ambiguity was never a flaw. It was the design. Let's dig in. This world is one where Epstein Island is a name that still tugs public imagination like a drama fishing hook dipped in psychological retention barnacles. But the island was never releasing evidence packets. It was releasing pressure maps. And Meghan Vale's presence wasn't archived as guilt indexing or inventory handling. It was archived as elastic narrative leverage yield value. Which means her attendance at philanthropy was used as a pressure point for constitutional retaliation framing packets deployed into the public sphere first before the forensic team touched the chain of custody filing systems. In this universe, Epstein didn't break law for celebrities. He archived celebrities for law pushback optic shareholders inside the Monarchy PM Hollywood standoff narrative bracket. But let's introduce someone new, someone pivotal, Helena Crane. Helena Crane was a forensic investigator in every way that matters for this world. Her reputation was built not on charisma, but on certainties, the kind that don't trend because they don't burn, but they matter because they don't budge. She worked in rooms filled with artifacts, not assumptions. She believed footage doesn't lie, but narratives do. She believed names don't light fires, ecosystems do. She believed victims don't always look innocent when guilt is profitable for someone else. She believed chain of custody is the DNA of justice, not the seasoning. And seasoning arrives after digestion. But this story isn't about Helena. Not yet. And we're in the moment where her presence turns from rumor fire into constitutional fuse lighter code, room moral misunderstanding cabinets mapped to index name friction optics. Useful civilian value face equals political optics pressure point for influence shareholders. Vault 47 logs weren't unsealing guilt indexing or inventory logging. It was unsealing narrative elasticity bullet points at the intersection of monarchy governance advisory standoffs and studio optics stakeholders that had nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with her global name friction indexing score. Now imagine this corridor moment from the island. She enters a spa lounge corridor. Just a corridor. White dress. Confidence and unawareness blended like champagne and naivete. Security holds a door. No interaction. No exchange. Just internal logging. Epstein stands far back, discussing constitutional optics with Prince Edwin. Not her. Never her. But the cameras logged her face, not her agency. Because agency wasn't needed. Only ignition value was. Let me break down the emotional sprawl that occurred next in the timeline. She learned the footage existed not in a room, but online. Her face was tokenized without agency. Her name was interpreted faster than it was investigated. Her silence was interpreted faster than transcripts could respond. Her tears were interpreted first as guilt, second as collapse, and last as truth-late canonical retention spike. And every media outpost building a shareholder-owned narrative ammo protocol found itself asking the wrong question first. Did she do it? instead of the right question. Why was her name profitable to unseal? Now let's talk about the timeline compression anomaly that made this story retention gold. Most scandals unfold over months. This one unfolded over minutes, with months of groundwork invisible. And the groundwork's invisibility is what made the story's virality inevitability plausible. Did you know that Epstein's fictional Vault 47 archive was sealed through the following track-of-value architecture? NDA lattice encryption overlay, not with names, but with cohorts. Physical footage stored under dummy IPs blending philanthropic optics codename overlays. Access logs scored for elastic interpretation warfare, not participation. Security proximity motion tracking across lounges with 19 camera nodes logging influence capacity. Government relations cabinets trembling at the thought of unsealed names and perceived culpability friction spikes. Media pipeline ping rooms preparing moral outrage codename bracket propagation waves not matching participation logs. And a civilian whose face burned bright enough to cast monarchy shadows across constitutional rooms far above her pay grade. The footage was never admitted as evidence. Her name was admitted as a narrative detonator. And this is modern exploitation. Identity as leverage. Now I want you asking again. What if the crying clip in this universe's story was sincere but selectively framed? What if Prince Edwin was leaking civilians into constitutional optics cabinets to pressure governance rooms without prosecution logic and to amplify monarchy friction optics without filings? What if the archive unsealing wasn't about confirming celebrity guilt, but about confirming narrative value elasticity, shareholding leverage maps stored inside government, monarchy timeline standoff cabinets? How many other rising stars carried a name that could burn faster than the truth teams indexed? Because that's the next twist. There were other names, but her name was the first match on the perception friction yield index. Epstein in this world collected perception currency logs. Edwin financed the files. The island financed the doubt. Her face financed the virality. And Helena Crane wasn't even on the list because verifiable truth wasn't profitable shareholder press for monarchy versus PM constitutional sprawl optics. That would come later. Now that the public ignited, the story became unstoppable for retention. You don't get to see the raw footage, reaction YouTube channels said. But you saw the clip, didn't you? The brokers responded. And Helena Crane, the investigator of this universe, understood privately what the internet didn't understand publicly. The footage was real to the archive, but the interpretation was not real to the participation. Now let's talk about why this story matters in 2025 inside this universe. Because constitutional friction stories live forever online when they weaponize names faster than anonymous power brokers, and the unsealing matters less than the name selection process that worked invisibly behind it. This moment matters now because the internet has learned nothing and everything at once since Epstein-style archive myths started trending. We know leaks are engineered. We know narratives replace evidence. We know celebrity names are easier to convert into ammunition. And we know royals are better protagonists for scandal retention than institutions. And yet we click every time. Why? Because curiosity gaps are deeper than shame. Let me say that again. Curiosity gaps are deeper than shame. And Edwin of this universe understood something else. If a civilian gets tied to a moral panic, constitutional rooms will crack open faster than if the narrative accused an institution whose name doesn't trend. The difference between a valuable narrative chip and an evidence packet? The narrative burns hotter. The evidence burns slower. And the archival brokers knew that by the time evidence teams got involved, public opinion consumption would have already digested the civilian's agency from the clip. And digesting agency is the most dangerous deletion of all when guilt is interpretable. Let's continue. In this fictional world, the crying clip, that moment of emotional collapse, was passed to outpost media rooms as an 8-way contradictory psychological beat grid map sprawl. Theme layer artwork by 19 camera nodes recording corridor entries for elasticity indexing score pushback, not participation. Her breakdown is indexed to 3 reaction YouTube channels. The public's assumption that she was guilty is delivered faster than Prince Edwin's motive record canonical unseal order chain of custody credibility handshake fracturing file map standoff. Now we must step into the emotional beat that follows the mechanics. Because behind every index log is a human experience that doesn't get pre-written. Meghan Vale's tears were a result of a massive realization. She was recorded, not recruited. She attended, not understood. She walked past power, but power walked past her too. She got logged by cameras she never saw. And in this universe's first 72 hours of the leak, the internet turned her silence into proof of culpability because absence of response is always interpreted at maximum negative assumption yield value for retention. Are you asking why they needed tears? Because dramatic tears make the victimhood ambiguous enough to be misread as confession first and collapse second and trauma last. And misreads trend better than truth. In this chapter, there were no prosecutors, no lawyers, no filings, no trials. Only clips, metadata, rumors, psychological monarchy friction shareholders, and a civilian's useful name co-opted for a leverage optics arbitration meltdown. And isn't that just the modern truth when power needs a mirror? That scandals live longer than evidence because evidence doesn't carry a familiar face. The public assumed the rumored favor was a person. The archive codename Logic meant it was leverage, not human, just profitable. Now let's tie it all up before we end the chapter. Epstein Vault 47 sealed attendance logs under a philanthropy disguise that looked glamorous in photos, but lethal in narrative elasticity scoring. Prince Edwin unsealed selective clips for constitutional pressure optics. Meghan Vale was indexed because of recognition value, not participation value. Her silence was interpreted because interpretation is faster than transcripts. Her tears were used because emotional ambiguity burns gold SEO retention. And Helena Crane, the investigator who will appear later, wasn't even in the viral arc yet because truth arrives too late to trend. And now the push-forward retention cliffhanger that carries us into Chapter 4. But when Helena Crane finally cracked the index list months later inside this archive world, she didn't ask what crimes happened on the island. She asked who else was captured on the list. And what she found next wasn't footage. It was leverage, names, and a governance standoff detonator waiting with more matches. The world thought the scandal was about a clip, but the real cliff was the list. The list had more gravity than the island had sand. Provocative question to pull you in. If the cameras were accountants of perception, what happens when the ledger itself becomes the leak? Let's step into Helena Crane's war room. Because Chapter 4 is the chapter where the slow truth finally starts sprinting to catch the rumor, even though rumor still has a massive head start. She didn't enter this saga theatrically. She entered it analytically. That is already the first contradiction. Because Helena wasn't investigating innocence or guilt. She was investigating orchestration. The archive lab of Oceanus Data Coalition, the one-off legal maps, existed quietly for years. But when the fictional footage from the island matured into leverage ammo for Prince Edwin, the seed was planted to unseal names instead of evidence. And the result? A wildfire that had no courtroom, but had 100 million eyeballs. If you've made it this far, congratulations. Your curiosity survived longer than most governments survive pressure leaks. Now let's visualize the room where the counter-strategy began to take shape. The evidence board was massive. Strings crisscrossed like narrative nerve endings. Photos pinned not as proof, but as pressure nodes in a perception web. And every node answered one question. Who is useful to weaponize? Helena Crane started at the end, the name index refracted against monarchy optics. Then she worked backwards to the moment when 8 newsrooms received rumor packets earlier than Twitter did. But before I go further, I need another question burning in your mind. What happens when the investigation proves the targeting, but the public still wants a villain? Let me tell you, the investigation wins the filing, but not the retention. Retention is always a popularity contest of theories, not closure. And Helena understood this better than most investigators because she wasn't naive enough to treat public opinion like an afterthought. The footage in this universe was stored across 19 camera nodes, each positioned to log influence flow elasticity. But the archive ledger itself, detached from island optics and tied to pipeline profitability, was encoded differently. Here's what Helena found when digging into Vault 47's architecture. The footage logs were chronological. The name index logs were political. The release nodes were psychological. The shareholders were institutional. And the civilian faces were the payload containers. She also found contradictory entries, intentional anomalies, and emotional scoring brackets appended long after filming dates. Now here are the surprising fictional facts she uncovered in this world. Epstein's fictional archive engineers never had permission to record beyond corridor entries, but recorded anyway because scoring value mattered more than consent. The unseal order that released clips was keyed to 3 constitutional pressure nodes inside London cabinet rooms, not tied to any prosecution chamber. Prince Edwin financed the clipping dissemination keys through dummy advisors who operated independently enough to look accidental but coordinated enough to trend structurally. Meghan Markle wasn't interacting with anyone on camera. She was walking past interactions the world would later claim she participated in. The crying clip was real, but the accusation was extrapolated from an 11-second slice that lacked transcript overlay or chain of custody annotation. But it goes deeper. Let's break down how narrative abuse metastasized faster than truth could scale. Helena found that 6 separate rumors about Meghan Markle's island attendance had already matured before the footage unsealed. Each rumor slightly different, which is exactly how viral ecosystems work in fiction and in the real world too. No rumor was strong enough to ruin her reputation alone. But 6 at once? That's reputational thermonuclear fission. And the public loves stories that fission. Helena didn't just find footage. She found timeline ecology. How rumors got planted into adjacent server channels. The actress tagged as socialite inventory in gossip nodes. The monarchy press tagged as leaked protocol compliance room moral outrunners. Government compliance rooms tagged as constitutional casualty cabinets capable of crack propagation based on civilian name resolution friction. Helena's notes included media pressure codename logic annotated into the footage metadata diagram that looked nothing like evidence documentation diagrams because this universe preferred cognitive intrigue retention graphs over canon truth transcripts. Her investigations didn't trend. Not yet. So how does an investigation catch up to a rumor that already burned across 8 newsrooms, 19 mirror upload nodes, and 12 bot spike latency relays? You change the story. You flip the currency. Instead of letting her name burn for retention, you make the unsealing profitable for truth, not shame. This is where the chapter's emotional beat peaks. Helena was sitting there with the complete index list of Vault 47. Names from Hollywood, NGOs, European aristocracy, royal periphery lines, billionaire social assets, even unknown social chaperones who had served different narrative roles in photos versus access logs. And what Helena found? That Meghan Markle's name wasn't the only famous qualifier on Epstein's Island Index, but it was the most useful to leak first. And let me break something emotional here. For retention, not fluff. Because in broker worlds, exploitative indexing doesn't need consent or awareness manipulation to be functional. Only release timing to apply semantics to dissemination influence war shareholder determinant anomalies operations later. Meghan Markle wasn't the only person filmed for perception currency, but she was the only one who could fracture the internet fast enough to pressure a monarchy standoff that needed distraction, debate, and moral outrage heat flare protocols. Here are the emotional contradictions Helena wrestled with internally. I'm saving her name, but it wasn't hers to destroy. The cameras logged her for retention vulnerability, but not participation. She's crying, but she isn't confessing. Guilt was extrapolated, not recorded. Innocence was plausible, but not profitable to leak first. The public wants her agency dead, but the archive listed it as irrelevant from day 0. And that's when Helena realized the bigger horror in this universe. Not the party corridor, but the series of names that were ready for future narrative abuse deployment when constitutional optics mattered more than ledger authorization metrics. So she made her call. A call that didn't just change the story for Meghan Markle, but changed the story's shareholders. The next leak wouldn't be a clip. It would be a counterfile. But there were still 14 names left on the index list inside Vault 47. And Helena Crane knew the next unseal wouldn't burn one civilian. It would burn perception shareholders. And that match was already in someone's hand. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The leak wasn't the scandal. It was the signal. But the signal just changed shape. Many hooked to grab the audience again. If the footage was the spark, then what happens when the person holding the lighter finally steps into the flame? This chapter begins where the story's wires trembled like live current, where Helena Crane realized the next file was a message, not footage. And not just any message. The kind sealed so deep you can't tell whether it protects someone, threatens someone, or prepares to erase someone. So let's start here, at the night the counterfile hid its first wall of silence. Not public silence. Institutional silence. Epstein's collectors didn't go quiet because they feared truth. They went quiet because truth wasn't the threat they were guarding against. The real threat was who would decode the message first. And decoding was exactly what Helena Crane did next, manually, methodically, obsessively. You see, digital inquisitors usually chase drama's spark. Helena chased the blackout that followed it. Now, I want you to ask yourself this right now. What's scarier than a secret? The moment the secret has to protect itself by pretending to leak something else first. Helena cracked the island footage system frame by frame, but she cracked the communications layer symbol by symbol. Because Vault 47 stored 3 kinds of encrypted assets. Footage logs, stored chronologically like event fossils. Name index logs, scored politically like leverage ammunition. Message codes, sealed like narrative trigger devices. The first 2 were leaked. The third was guarded. Why? Because clips create villains. Messages create architects. And architects don't trend unless someone can name them. But Helena didn't want the architect named. She wanted the architect cornered by logic inescapability. So let's rewind a bit deeper into Helena Crane's archive breach process, because that's where this gets really interesting. She didn't trust timestamps alone. She trusted mutation, the way a file evolved between sealing and unsealing, the way a rumor evolved into pressure, the way a civilian's name elasticity evolved into royal family mythology combat shockwaves that cracked open constitutional rooms, even though none of this was tied to factual participation. That's when Helena ran a comparative integrity check between leaked footage, proximity logs, and message classification. And what she found was not what the internet wanted to hear, but it was everything it needed to fear. The message was a signal key used by an unseen orchestrator named Prince Edwin Collateral Deployment Protocol Packet 2026, and that's a code phrase, not a human involvement claim. Don't look at it literally. Look at what it did, not what it said. The protocol packet remarked the actress's face as highest constitutional pressure ignition score point asset available to leak first in advantage misinformation adoption algorithmic plausible dissemination ecology quadrant. In short, her name was an accelerant. Her agency was never archived at all. But what happened next wasn't encoding wrongdoing of the civilian. It was encoding shareholder warfare anxiety. Because once Helena decoded the Abbott packet layer, the fictional NGO monarchy conflict overlay in international optics channels, she realized the story needed a next ignition unless institutions wanted to watch their own perception shareholders walk into flames. Now we're stepping deeper into the retention logic you came for. Have you ever wondered what would happen if an unsealed archive only revealed you walked past the powerful, but a coded communications exploit rewrote your presence into something morally elastic enough to fracture constitutional digestion optics? You ever ask yourself how metadata leaks get weaponized as narrative signing packet transaction rewriting index logs across 3 tiers for public digestion pacing, so the audience keeps asking questions longer than governments demand closure filings? That's what was in motion here. Let's talk Helena's tools again, not the flashy ones. The quiet, terrifying ones. She ran 19 camera nodes, authenticity parsing cross-verification. She mapped 56 rumor origination server nodes. She backtraced 8 seeded news ethos outposts chain of moral first assumption yield value. She cracked 3 classification schemas off legal map influence indexing constellation packet trees. She collated chaperone pass nodes who existed only as outpost socialite corridor chaperone symbolic threshold pass logs. She extracted 9 metadata strings referencing philanthropic event codes, not participation TANs. Then she asked one question that matters more than all others. Who benefits when a clip gets released at dawn, but the legend gets released at midnight? The answer isn't fame. It's fire control. Now imagine her digging deeper into the archive classification communication logs for monarchy versus PM standoff. Epstein catalogs only mattered to share recognition, friction, stakeholder, participant, footface, indexing score, attendance, victim pack scores that were never meant to convict celebrities, fictional or real, but to pressure institutions by misdirecting the public to shame civilians who burn better than shareholders who trend anonymously. And that pressure was real to the psychological nervous system of the monarchy cabinets reacting to an unsealed order that didn't bring evidence, but brought friction, value cascade, meltdown, blueprint, engagement, coded latch, resonance, orchestrator, anomaly. That's when Helena found that the government, monarchy standoff, shareholder conflict had its own deep waveform retention index coding meltdown padding, manufactured by Pacific traffic route data splits such as tourist corridor spaghetti IP stacks and philanthropy code level carat corridors dressed in optics-coated carpets. Which means the story's deeper anchors were the UK cabinet under PM Harrington, completely fictional, debating monarchy interference anomaly packets. The palace comms equivalent office bracing for underground archive capture, suspicion, cross-adoption, timeline split, walls scorching if narrative receipt, tokens would absorb moral theater guilt earlier than evidence bracket for public friction yield, while archive logs were financing rumor shareholders to pressure faults, not proceedings. Let's break the contradiction that Helena cracked early in Vault 47. Epstein built a system he didn't personally operate. Prince Edwin financed a system he didn't personally enter. Meghan Markle was indexed by a system she didn't personally see. The palace was pressured by a system it couldn't personally name. The internet amplified a system it couldn't personally decode. And decoding is where the tempo switches, so pay attention now. This story's retention worked like braided rope. Shock launches you outward. Questions drag you deeper. Ambiguity makes it personal. Celebrity optics make it viral. Truth makes it memorable. But shareholders must get exposed gradually or retention dies. Helena didn't want guilty civilians. She wanted guilty orchestration pipelines. So she reversed the spine of the story. Instead of letting the civilian's name take the hit, she let the institutions take the question. But questions are weapons too. So what did Helena do next in this world? She built 3 counterpressure dossiers disguised as documentary intrigue segments. Dossier 1, the Citizen Corridor Log. Harmless, complete attendance, no involvement claim. Dossier 2, the Shareholder Index Elasticity List, showing 14 peripheral names co-indexed for future pressure but not wrongdoing in corridor events. Dossier 3, the Orchestrator Motive Finance Lattice, showing Prince Edwin financed the leak routing for constitutional standoff cabinets months before the footage ever unsealed. And dossier formats matter because evidence is slow, but pattern recognition is faster than silence can suppress. You ever ask yourself why truth doesn't need bold claims, but retention does? Because retention is a war of attention pacing. And pacing was the architecture Helena threw back at the world. Let's talk what was locked inside the coded message that Helena cracked. The message wasn't describing an exchange. The message was describing a threshold move. A move of narrative leverage from hidden corridors into spotlight, fission readiness, deployment, yield value for constitutional pressure, optics, warfare, adoptable timelines, first before forensic teams could reverse route timeline maps, respondent payload, re-escalation cluster, engagement coded Jacqueline Lane Strata indexing from Twitter mirrors to NGO monarchy coder loops, 2026 fictional codename. Protocol coded investor nodes, radarization foliage. In short, this message was indexing the civilian face not for participation, but for public moral shock electricity propagation. And the public moral shock propagation was financed by someone who never physically entered the footage frame, but financed the release framing keys to ignite debate, pressure, and moral outrage. Pause logs across monarchy PM standoff optics that would shack affect winner whichever side could unseal first in public interpretation ingestion courts. Let's dial into the monarch studio friction subplot. In this fictional story, the royal family PR team didn't panic because a civilian was filmed in a corridor. They panicked because the name could be used to fracture parliament relevance optics at a moment when public myth shareholders preferred palace gossip, spectacle grid loops, to source physical evidence, holdings, indexing sprawl. This story never gets retention spikes if the public sees a random archipelago file. It needs a face the world argues over first. Prince Edwin collateral deployment packet mapping predicted that friction yield value scoring enough to be unsheathed into moral outrage cookrooms, internal monarchy crisis adoption auction able timeline loops across legal approvals, which will never prosecute ephemeral imagery misconduct RNG hallway logging. And Helena saw this, that the tears traveled faster than truth. That silence was interpreted as culpability. And she was going to change the interpretation lens. But here's the twist. The twist the story shareholders never expected. The Abbott packet wasn't framed to guess someone's location. It was framed to guess someone's narrative combustion value. And narrative combustion value doesn't trend anonymously. Now let's put the next emotional beat on the table. Because optics closets hide something more addictive than secrets. They hide arcs of shame, confusion, betrayal, and psychologically believable victim framing latents that collectors wait to disseminate until the monarchy PM conflict needs a face that cracks institutional silence at retention speed, not evidence speed. Meghan Vale wasn't crying in isolation in breakdown file because she was guilty in actions.